Hello, we're now at lecture number 2 of the Architecture Design Studio 3 course on architecture theory. This is a couple of parts. This is the part 1, specific on critical thinking, which is an approach to learning so that you can acquire some skills and competence in architecture theory. And for this first part, we'll focus on modernism or the modernist architects. So the modernist architects on the right is what we'll focus on today, and later on we'll focus on phenomenology. So what is the aim of this 2 series is to develop a sense of the architectural critique in you. There are things that you need to pick up, that is understanding precedents or precedents, whichever you would like to call it, telling a story or a narrative, and as I said, the architectural critique skill, and focusing on understanding whether the architecture that you are learning about in the context of modernism or modernist architects for this lecture is designing out of context or designing in context. So we're going to learn about context. So this material, looking at their work, will be on how we deal with precedents. How do we actually, when we are thinking about architecture, how do we deal with precedents? So understanding precedents. So precedents or precedents are models or examples that you refer to that has happened before you. Not in the future, not you doing now, but something you are studying that has happened before you are doing your design or learning about it. Yeah, it has happened before. So one of the things about architectural theory is learning from precedents. Learning about how things came about, what were the architect maybe have a body of work, design numerous buildings, and the buildings are buildings that, or the architecture is something that people like to refer to or being made use as a precedent. So the architect is dealing with a lot of things like form and space and anything to do with the architectural language that you have learned in graphic communication before and what you've studied so far. So it is not something totally new. You have been dealing with precedents. So another thing that you need to be aware of is understanding context. And when I said designing in context and designing out of context are 2 different things. And as we move along, I shall explain those things. Find out what the word context is. Yeah. And in this respect, specific to architecture or design. We also understand about the issue of form and space. And in space is about function in architecture. And this is something that we will look into in this lecture. So these are the work of people that we may look into in this lecture and the references. Some images from the Bauhaus art movement on the right. Someone called Peter Behrens in 1908, 1910 designed and built this factory AEG turbine factory. This is at a time when a factory is a new thing because of the Industrial Revolution, and much in Europe are having to deal with a new type of building called a factory. So they don't know how to dress it up because previously there was no example of what a factory should be, how it should look like, right? So Peter Behrens, when you look at the form of this particular factory, still have something that is alluding to the classical form, almost like a pediment top with two bedded columns. But then when you start looking at it, there is some new material or new construction that is being used, such as steel and glass during this time, yeah? Because previously we were looking at more of stone architecture and brickwork. So it is something that is exploratory or pushing the boundaries with regard to a new typology at that time. But he decided to still use some language of classical architecture, although you can't really see classical orders there in the form of the factory being long in shape and form, how you're going to dress up at the ends. So this is one of the challenges that Peter Behrens needed to do. Le Corbusier worked with Peter Behrens at one point. So this is the interior of it, totally new. You have to deal with steel, portal frame, and you have to have a span that accommodate to the equipment that is going to be inside the factory and how the processes of need to be done with the huge equipment inside. And at the side, you have 2 stories where there are smaller spaces that needn't have that much space as the main one. So this is what the architects at that time has to deal with if they design a factory. Where is Peter Behrens with regard to what has happened? I was mentioning about the Industrial Revolution, the arts and craft movement that happened, and how in Germany they were looking they were looking at England's Industrial Revolution and how the architecture development of that country, and they visited. There was somebody who were asked to visit England, and they come up with Das English House, because there were, as I said about the Garden City movement and arts and craft movement, there were a lot of innovation in England, as you know it, in the Industrial Revolution. So Bismarck, the emperor, was very much instrumental in getting the Germany up to scratch in terms of trying to compete or try to emulate or try to innovate and try to get into, chase after the English. You have other things that's happening like Art Nouveau, and some of this Workbund exhibition, for example, was created, and the Deutsche Workbund, which is an association of artists and artisan or workers, started and eventually led to Bauhaus. But there is a step that happens before the Bauhaus, which is Gropius, somebody who is influential of how Bauhaus came about, in which we shall see in the next photograph. After the Vegas factory, Walter Gropius became one of the head of school at Bauhaus, and a highly regarded architect and the founding father of modernism, and the founder of the Bauhaus, the German school of building. We should talk about the Bauhaus later. And in the Bauhaus, you have the elements of art, architecture, graphic design, interior design, industrial design, and typography in its design, development, and production. And wow, when you look at the Bauhaus, why are there a lot of rectilinear forms, but they are of different forms? Now, when we talk about Bauhaus, this is literally translated to construction house, originated as a German school of arts in the early 20th century. It led to its own modern art movement. A lot of individuals were influential to what happened in the art movements in Europe. And at that time, in 1919, Walter Gropius proposed a radical vision for a new institution that would erode distinctions between artists and artisans. And this is unprecedented, something new. Before, it was more of the classical tradition based on the Beaux-Arts when you are an architect, but then this is something totally new. A lot of experimentation was done since Industrial Revolution 1890s, and the use of, like I said, the Peter Behrens building, and the use of concrete, the use of glass. And in Germany, there were quite a number of individuals that were exploring this new material. So there was an age where some new thinking, rather than the old thinking, was happening. And they created a school where half of the year there will be a course, a compulsory course, where you deal with basic form study. So then you go into a lot of other studies on materials, nature, fabrics, color study, and construction. And you focus on certain materials in those 3 years, and then you build it on site and test it out. So it could be furniture, it could be interior design, it could be architecture. And that was interesting about the Bauhaus, where the concept of the workshop was key for what Gropius say in his manifesto, because the school, the Bauhaus school, is the servant of the workshop. So everything happens in that workshop, all the ideas that tutor and students, come into collaboration, and they teach theories of color and form, principles of composition, studies of materiality, exercise in life drawing and visual analysis. And there were artists, there were artisans, architecture wasn't really in the beginning the bigger deal. Later on it was. So at the same time, we have the Deutsche Workman that is flourishing as well, which is the idea of what Bismarck started, and in Germany of a workers' association. So the Bauhaus building itself was kind of interesting in the sense that there is almost like what do you call it, rectilinear blocks with bridges, and the bridge number 4 is the admin building, and the technical college is number 5, the one in front, and then the studios number 3, number 2. There are different blocks, and also the workshop block, which is number 1. So this is quite elementary, elementalism, meaning that expressing the form and function, a form follows the function. So there are different functions, and then you articulate the form around the function. And yeah, this is one of the things that's characterizing when we talk about critical architecture or critical thinking in architecture, and Gropius is one of them, that because of this new type, like I said, the factory, the school, the Bauhaus school, they explore that aspects of functionalism. And in Fager's factory in 1911 as well, and Workburn Pavillion in 1914. Previously, they were only interested in the classical orders or the form outside. And they only had one sort of architecture language, but now they can explore different architecture language. Another individual, we would like to propose the idea that the architects at that time, they did a lot of study. Like I said, Le Corbusier, he started with Maison Citrohan in 1922, the first of the houses, or the design of houses, in which he wrote into what's the new architecture of Greek temples and automobiles and different types. Yeah, so he was talking about type, the issue of type. A temple always look like that, and you can't go and use the classical orders on everything. You know, thereafter there are all sorts of building typology, but using classical orders, but you know, and the car, which is different. One is the Humber and later the Delage. They differ because of time. As time goes on, they're different. So he was working on the idea of the villa or housing, where the architectural language should not be what they call it, replicated exactly as before. You know, you should innovate on that. So hence, why the pun Citrohan is the name of a car, but yeah, Citrohan. The idea of using mass production processes became something that excited them, where Ford used on cars to solve the housing crisis of the post-war years. So this was quoted by Curtis. Project Citrohan, with the forms of a typical studio house, raised to the level of a universal mass-produced dwelling, comparable to a car in price and availability. It should be cheaper to produce mass housing and available for everyone. So there was the issue during the war, after the war, and again after World War II, of how do we house a lot of people, and you know, from the problems of the war in terms of finding housing and rebuilding, because a lot of places were destroyed. So Le Corbusier perceived industrialism and technology as improving society, which is what he was attempting to do with the design of his houses, living conditions of people's everyday lives. The house should be designed to be efficient for people's day-to-day tasks, but it was also designed to be built with materials that could be mass-produced and that were easily accessible, such as concrete. These factory-made, mass-produced items resemble parts in an assembly line, revealing Le Corbusier's plan for the Citroën house to mimic not only the cost efficiency, but also its method of production. This led to the 5 points of a new architecture in 1926, where the diagrams compared potentials of reinforced concrete as opposed to traditional masonry system of construction. And he did 4 compositions in 1929 of the different villas, La Roche, Gache, Wiesenhofsiedlung, Stuttgart, and Villa Savoy, and he compared them and how they were developed like, you know, prototypes of buildings. And when references were alluding to what Palladio did earlier with the Villa Rotunda, in which the preoccupation is with form and order, where the house is a machine for living, that was quote unquote, such as Villa Savoy in 1928, is like the climax or the epic, the end game for him when he actually built what he developed from the beginning with Maison Citrohan. Now it is Villa Savoy. And the whole idea of at the ground floor, you arrive by car and you go up a ramp and you go to the middle plan, which is on the top there. Main spaces such as kitchen, bedroom, and living spaces and terraces. And then you go up the ramp to the top, which is a roof terrace. And that is where you could actually have another sort of activity up there on the roof terrace. But this was depicting the 5 points of a new architecture that he proposed in his book. Another protagonist during that time is Mies van der Rohe. He was also involved in the Bauhaus. Le Corbusier also visited the Bauhaus school, and so did Mies. And I think Mies was involved as one of the, if he's not the director at one time, he was an important figure. And the style, the influence of the style, the Dutch movement with German Bauhaus. I mean, they were exchanging of ideas a lot. And even from Russia, there was some of the tutors at the Bauhaus, such as Liszewski, influenced Mies van der Rohe, and he had a design of a project for a brick villa in 1923 that was influenced by Liszewski's prunes. I think it's prunes. Is it pronoun? Noun? Prune. Okay, prune. Study for prune, SK, is a suprematist watercolor that L. Liszewski did in 1922. So you can see that this it's not a central, there's no centrality or a common center. It seems like it is exploding, the form, and asymmetrical, and is floating as well. So this is some of the ideas of suprematists. This influenced his Barcelona Pavillion in 1928, using different materials, horizontal and vertical elements placed around a pool, creating this spaces for display and for the visitors to go around and enjoy the space. So tangibly, there is some influence from Liszewski's prunes and his earlier work. This is how it looks in color. So the material is again green marble and glass and travertine. The vertical elements are all different. And the water body is also an element, like a mirror-like element. And the horizontal hovering roof is another element. So you can't really see much columns there, but use of such a thing as almost is sculptural in itself. Mies van der Rohe also look at the volume using steel and glass, and the construction that he decided to hang on this main steel. These are these portal frames or steel frames, hung most of the structure, the roof structure, and minimize on the elevation because you've taken away the weight, the traditional way of designing. You would have much more. In Schinkel's Altus Museum on the right, you can see that that is a classical order where you have this pronounced columns, colonnades, and stonework, but the plan below is a plan of the Crown Hall IIT in Chicago, where Mies van der Rohe designed. So the proportion of Schinkel's office museum at the turn of the century is maintained in terms of the volume and the proportion, where Mies van der Rohe did the staircase and other elements, and it is still symmetrical. It is still having that sense of proportion, but you don't have so much the solidity as before, but you're looking at the volume. Yeah, so far you've listened about Le Corbusier, you've seen the work of Mies van der Rohe, Walter Gropius earlier. Walter Gropius was dealing with elementalism and the volume and so on. These are designing out of context. They were more concerned about the prototype or the building itself or the architecture. They were not really concerned of context in a sense, what is outside, what the people or the place around that piece of architecture. There was not much concern about that. Frank Lloyd Wright, he was still concerned about the building and how the architecture looked, and it had the architectural language of the classical top, middle, and base. It had the three parts. So the roof was more pronounced, the middle is less pronounced, and the base is more pronounced. But it's still alluding to the idea of the classical tradition where you have the pediment, the columns, and the base in Renaissance architecture and classical architecture. But the language of vernacular is being used here. It is a house. So this is one of the first houses that Frank Lloyd Wright did in America. And it was at the prairies, or the area in Midwest in America in 1893. And this is the first of his architectural language, or his prairie houses. Is there a context? Is he designing in context? He was thinking about the horizontality of the prairie, of the area there, because there's a lot of, the prairie, as you know, is fields, and there's lack of, that's where the agricultural land and where this is the, what do you call it? The character, topography, and the character of the prairie land. We're not talking about Mies van der Rohe in Germany anymore. We're not talking about Le Corbusier in France, where they have a different sort of situation. We're talking about America. And you have clients as well that want a sense of feeling that it's a house. So he had to deal with the context a bit. But he was playing with some sort of, he was influenced as well with the style and the Bauhaus, although he's in America. So there is that control mechanism of the design, which is the fireplace or the hearth right in the middle. And he designed the corridor and the main spaces of this middle space. Yeah, so there's two stories, and on the right is the one that is on the ground, and there's a certain form of axis and a certain asymmetrical elements. They're not all symmetrical, like Palladio's Rotunda. This is in keeping with what Mies van der Rohe was also exploring, influences from suprematism, and a bit floating. How's it like to be? And then it became more mature after a while. This was in 1902. This is 1908. He designed everything. He designed the interior, and it was in keeping with the arts and craft movement. John Ruskin, William Morris, in England. Frank Lloyd Wright was basically on his own, actually. Is one of those that's been referred to a lot, and he built a lot of these bungalows and prairie houses. Here for the Robbie house, it's just two rectilinear elements, and what is it that is the hinge that, or the spaces that pull them together, you know? So, and some of the space of the main space, the dining and the living, and you have the hearth there, but there is an intermediate or interface where it flows into the other rooms. So depending on the site, he has to work with the site. He uses the same architectural language, and it became more overhang. Yeah, the roof, it looks like it's floating. It become more of the international style, but it's still pitch roof here. So we see that Frank Lloyd Wright in 1904 in the Martin Estate played with the similar, the style and sentiments of what is happening in Europe in terms of asymmetrical and decomposition, you know, or rather going away from a centrality. So this leads us to the international style, which became pervasive globally thereafter. Different functions with similar styles. People were running away from, they were looking to functional aspects with Gropius and the Bauhaus, as you recall, but now it evolved to a style where there is a different function.
Sorry, I couldn't hear what you said.
So this is the modernist style when we talk about the modern buildings. Strip windows, flat roofs, grids of support, cantilevered horizontal plane, metal railings and curved partitions. Simple rectangular volumes emphasizing hovering planes and interpenetrating planes. So this happens since the 1920s, and somehow in the 60s and 70s, people start doing other things, other styles, and those were the late modernists, going into the postmodernists much more in the 1980s. This was the Weissenhof Siedlung housing, where different architects like Sharon and Mies van der Rohe participated in, and this is Le Corbusier's. So all similar characteristics on the international style. And we mentioned about functionalism just now. In 1927 and 9 by Stam, Brinkmann, and Van der Vlugt, another factory. And somehow factories, they need to be functional because of their nature or type. A sanatorium by Beachvoort and Duiker in 1926 and 8. Functionalists. So you can still see international style in functionalists or functionalism. The League of Nations building competition, but it's more pronounced in terms of the form follows the function, yeah? In 1927 by Le Corbusier here. Housing prototypes started, Le Corbusier Unité d'Habitation Marseille. This is 20 years down the road in 1947 and 53, where this style is already established and there are more multi-story buildings being produced. Interesting prototype of housing, always being referred to by those doing housing, and how the concept of a cruise liner ship is being thought of when this was designed. But the idea that they have a double volume a facade, because it has a mezzanine floor and one other floor for each unit, is of interest to a lot of housing designers. And some spaces are designated for play, like the one on the top, on the roof, there is a swimming pool. And in the middle, there is also a community space. Housing prototypes abound in all over the world with similar international style, which is same characteristics, in the 1950s as well. Then the idea of brutalist or new brutalism architecture still is a bit of functionalism, but what is the difference between functionalism and brutalism is in the use of the material at its rawest state. Allison and Peter Smithson and James Sterling, are the two protagonists for this new architectural language. They had a lot of commissions doing school and university buildings in England. In particular, Allison and Peter Smithson, looking at materials and mass production as well, and how to get a system to be built as fast as possible, because there were a lot of schools needing to be built at that time. So when we talk about this topic is trying to give an idea about critical thinking and developing the skills and competence in actually using precedent in architecture. Precedence does not necessarily mean there have to be an architect that designed it. It could be to do with a type of building, like a religious building and how it's designed previously. It doesn't necessarily have to have an architect assigned that is the author of the building. It could be non-architects, yeah? And so you learn from anything that is before you. Precedents. It could be a design, or it could be a good design. You learn from the bad design, obviously, but the good design, you find out why is it good. This assists in understanding on architecture history when you could understand about the theoretical aspect. So you can see the similarities of architects' design over time from one architect to another. In the case of Peter Behrens, the factory that he designed, it became much more elemental and much more rectilinear as time goes by. But the idea of functionalism takes a precedence from the beginning until much of the modern movement. Identify generic solutions to design problems which transcend times. As I mentioned, the factory. As I mentioned, housing, and housing has always been something that connects the architects of the past, especially after the World War until now, where, the multi-story housing prototype became, in Unité d'habitation, became like the reference for housing in many parts of the world. So learning from precedents also make you able to develop an analysis as a tool for design, which you actually analyze the precedents and you find what's good and what's bad. There's a lot of things that you can learn from the precedents. It's not only about the form and space, it's also about the details, the elements, different elements of the building or the use of the building. And you can find information whether the building works or not with regard to the user. As an outcome of this, you were able to be more skillful in coming up with design vocabulary in your design, and you will form ideas and organize concepts and understand what partie is. So history is important, but theory of architecture is different than history because we're actually going into the different philosophy and design ideas of the different architects or non-architects, and especially understanding what is designing out of context and what is designing in context. So we will stop there with some of our thoughts regarding what happened in Britain and Germany, and it has to do with what is to do with the production and modernization of these countries and the onslaught of industrialization and how these countries need to create languages, create a way to narrate what is happening to them. And there were certain important events in that timeline with regard to how Germany had to cope, feeling that they have artists but no actual art, and that their products were cheap and nasty, and this led to the Bauhaus and the Deutsche Werken. So with that, I leave you with some reference, and thank you very much for your audience.